All right, today we're tackling one of those huge questions, What's the real deal with the connection between our spiritual side and our actual well-being? We're going to look at everything from ancient faith traditions to modern-day science to figure out how our search for meaning really, truly affects our health. So let's dive right in.
We're kicking things off with this incredible story from the faith healing tradition. And wow, it really captures such a powerful hope, doesn't it? The idea that a huge shift inside our minds, in our inner world, can create a real radical change in our physical bodies. This idea pretty much sets the stage for everything we're about to explore.
And yeah, that leads us right to our big question for today. Is there a link, like a real, measurable one, between spirituality and health? And if so, how in the world does it work? Is it an act of faith, a state of being, maybe a psychological thing, or something else completely? We're going to poke at this from a few different angles.
So let's start at the individual level with personal spiritual practice. When you look at the source material, you start to see two very, very different ways people try to connect to that spiritual side for healing. One is all about active, powerful faith, and the other is about a kind of quiet, receptive presence.
Check this out. It's kind of like two sides of the same coin, but they look completely different. On the one hand, you've got faith as action. The whole idea is to actively make a demand to, as the metaphor says, plug in to God's power. But then, on the other hand, spirituality as presence is, well, it's basically the opposite. It's all about surrender, about breathing, about just letting go and merging with something bigger. Let's look a little closer at each of these.
So this first path sees faith as an actual force, something you can activate. The laying on of hands isn't just a nice symbol, it's seen as a literal point of contact, a moment of transmission. The key idea here is that this healing power is a real thing that can be channeled from the spiritual world right into a person's physical body, all through an act of faith.
And then there's this path, which is almost a complete 180. Instead of actively trying to transmit power, this practice of breathing God is all about surrender and release. It's about softening up all those walls we build in our bodies and minds to dissolve that feeling of being a separate me. The goal is to shift from that feeling of separation to a direct physical experience of being one with a greater presence.
Okay, so we've got these really deep personal paths, but what happens when these ideas go public? How do they show up in a bigger societal way? Well, we find a really interesting answer in education, where spiritual development is actually seen as a crucial part of a kid's overall growth.
Now, in this educational setting, spirituality doesn't necessarily mean religion. It's really about values, and values are defined as these core qualities that we all agree are good things, like honesty, respect, compassion. These values then become the principles that guide how we behave and the standards we use to judge our own actions. It's basically a way to talk about and nurture a child's inner life without being tied to any single religion.
And this right here shows how those big abstract values get turned into real-world action. It's not just talk, it's practically a management plan. The whole school community, teachers, parents, students, they all work together to figure out their core values. Then they turn them into actual rules for behavior and weave them into everything, from school policies right down to the curriculum. And importantly, they make time for reflection and even try to measure the impact.
All right, so we've looked at personal practice and public education. Now, let's pivot and put on our lab coats for a minute. Let's look at the hard science. For the last few decades, researchers have actually been trying to measure if there's a link between being religious or spiritual in our health. So what does the data tell us?
This chart shows something pretty fascinating. Study after study has found this connection. People who believe in a good, loving God tend to have lower levels of anxiety. And we're not talking about a tiny, insignificant effect. One major study found that these beliefs could account for almost 10% of the difference in things like how much people worry or struggle with obsessive thoughts. That's a real, measurable impact.
And some of these stats are just staggering. Take this number, 68%. This comes from a huge long-term study that followed people over many years. It found that folks who went to religious services regularly, like at least twice a month, had a 68% lower risk of death by suicide. I mean, that is a massive, massive figure that really points to the protective power that a sense of community and shared belief can have.
But, and this is a really important but, the connection isn't always positive. Science shows us that it's way more complicated. It's kind of like a double-edged sword. On one side, you have all these positive factors, like getting support from your community or using prayer to cope, and those are linked to better health. But on the other side,
People can have what researchers call spiritual struggles, feeling angry at God, feeling abandoned, fighting with other believers. And these struggles, they're strongly linked to poorer mental health.
So, after all that, where does this leave us? We've taken a journey through theology, mysticism, education, and hard science. And I think it's pretty clear that the relationship between our search for meaning and our well-being is definitely not simple. But it is, without a doubt, incredibly profound.
So let's just quickly recap the 4 lenses we looked through. We saw the theological view, which is all about an active faith you can use. Then the mystical view, which is about finding an inner presence through surrender. We looked at the educational view, which frames it as core values for growth. And finally, the scientific view, which sees it as a complex psychological factor with real, measurable effects, both good and bad.
And that kind of brings us full circle, but hopefully with a much deeper sense of how complex this all is. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what you call it. Divine power, inner presence, core values, a psychological process. What's become crystal clear is that our search for meaning is not some side quest. It is a fundamental force that shapes our health, our happiness, and our entire journey through life. So the only question left, really, is how does it shape yours?